Okay,
Okay, this is working. Okay, so I'm here today with Vicky Iglikowski-Broad. As part of LGBT plus History Month, we are going to be discussing research into LGBT plus history in the National Archives. Vicky and I actually met during our masters at Royal Holloway. I think it was Amanda Vickery's 18th century women's class. It's all good. But now Vicky is the principal records specialist in diverse histories at the National Archives. And in this role, Vicky strives to promote marginalised histories in a state archive. And her research specialisms include the history of women and gender and the development of LGBTQ rights and queer spaces. And currently, at the moment, at the National Archives, you can visit their exhibition, The 1920s Behind the Raw, which includes a focus on some of the more forgotten histories. And it also includes items reflecting on LGBTQ lives. So, Vicky, I wanted to start off by just asking what kinds of records are actually held in the National Archives about LGBT plus lives?
thank you. Yeah, there's some really interesting material that we have at the National Archives around LGBTQ lives and experiences, but they come to us very much through a government context and through a government lens. So the perspective is essentially, I guess, biased by past governments' opinions on LGBTQ lives. So on a surface level, we often have quite negative things around LGBTQ lives and experiences. And yet, actually, when you delve into the records, there's amazing things that can be found that wouldn't necessarily get into other collections. So that can be things like kind of censorship, particularly around kind of lesbian experiences in the past and literature and the arts, or it can be around the policing, particularly of men's relationships with other men historically. And yeah, it does give us this kind of really interesting insight. So there's a real contradiction in what we hold. A lot of it's held for negative reasons, but actually can now kind of be used almost subversively to kind of shed a light on lives and experiences that we might not know much about otherwise. So just like my research interests that you mentioned around queer spaces, for example, often that's kind of in the 20s and 30s, policing of queer spaces, such as venues like the Caravan Club, which was a 1930s queer venue in London. And we know about it because of the policing, and yet now we can look back and we can read transcripts of what people were saying in the space, how they were being defiant to the police, how they were creating their own spaces in a time that kind of didn't allow that otherwise in more mainstream places. So yeah, very rich collections at the National Archives, but also quite contradictory in nature.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, sort of almost reinventing these kind of negative records and using them in a positive way to sort of shed light on these hidden lives. That's certainly been something I've come across in my research in archives. So with the National Archives, are there sort of differences between that and kind of, say, a more regional archive or a community-based archive? What are the sort of differences and things you might find?
Yeah, so the National Archives has quite a strict remit. It's very much about government records. We get records from government departments. And what we don't get to do is just kind of accession more current things because we, for example, see a gap in the collections. What we have is very much just from government. A lot of more regional archives or community archives will very much actively seek out kind of missing voices and experiences. And we don't get to do that at the National Archives. But our records are so vast that there's often stories and voices present, but they just need to be kind of searched for and kind of the records need to be interrogated. But in more regional or community archives, there are some fascinating projects going on to very actively seek voices that are kind of not so much part of the archival collection, maybe more personal papers. So, for example, I believe the London Metropolitan Archives has done great work. There are kind of projects looking very much at BAME experiences in the LGBT community and actively searching for those voices. More projects on kind of trans experiences as well. So very much kind of rectifying the archival narrative where some of these things have historically been missed in collections. So the National Archives can't do that But what we seek to do is work with communities or other archives to make sure that we are kind of pulling together the archive collections so that we're telling a fuller story. If we don't have those records in our own collections, then we'll seek to work with other people. But the National Archives is interesting in that way, that we can't actively seek out what we're missing as such.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that I've sort of found as a researcher. Quite often you're limited by these sort of parameters. In terms of mine, it's more sort of, there are very few examples in the period I'm studying of people of colour who had sort of gender nonconformity in their lives, or sort of a kind of more fluid lifestyle. It's very difficult to find that in Britain. And we've touched on sort of the biases in terms of the National Archive has to be sort of government records. I just wondered, are there any other kind of biases involved in that as well? Sort of, is there more representation of sort of certain groups or other groups at all?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So the National Archives collection is very much framed by past governments and their interests. So quite male in collections, quite focused on traditional kind of government and often military things, for example. But actually, the bias we have in our collection is towards kind of male-related LGBT history. And that's actually for kind of the opposite reason. And that's because of the policing and criminalisation of homosexuality between men in the past. So we do have a bias. There's a lot more records to do with that side of things. And yet that there are other experiences. So just because there wasn't the same policing in quite the same way of trans lives or gender non-conforming lives, it was still clearly kind of controversial, not widely accepted. So we do get records coming up in things like the General Registry Office records, where people's sex is being registered at birth, for example, or there's things to do with marriage licenses, where in terms of the law, they see maybe that two women are marrying, or otherwise those people might, given the language, identify as trans if they have those options available to them. But in terms of the law, they see it in a very cut and dried way. We have records to do with April Ashley, for example, and the way that the law sees her marriage. So records do come to us, but there is an overwhelming bias towards men's relationships with other men because of the criminalisation. And as I say, it's kind of other LGBTQ experiences come to us in other ways, but maybe kind of less obvious to find with women's relationships with other women. It's often more through censorship and things like that as well. And I completely agree with what you're saying about kind of Black and ethnic minority lives. They are less present in those intersecting areas where they relate to LGBT experiences as well. But we do have a wonderful example of a club called the Shimsham Club from the 1930s, which is very much a Black queer space. And it was very much about the jazz coming to London, and it was a very welcoming space. So there are examples, but they're kind of rare and all the more special to talk about because there aren't so many of those experiences necessarily recorded in the archive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting that there are sort of these things coming up even in sort of official archives and sort of the more government leaning kind of places. You can still get these stories coming up. And I would imagine particularly if they're sort of combined with maybe local archives, you could get a really rich picture going on. So I guess that leads on to my final question. I just wondered, just from the point of a researcher, what would you say are the sort of challenges and opportunities available in researching LGBT plus history in a government archive? Does this impact how people are able to research? And is there anything they can do to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, great question. So essentially, I'd say it's often about thinking, why would government be interested in this? And if you think about the why, you can start to understand where it might exist. Does it exist in a government archive? Is it of an interest to a specific department? Is that where you need to then look? So asking, why would government be interested? Why would they hold this material is always a good starting point to understanding if we hold something and where it might be. Definitely kind of with reference to your earlier point, working with government archives, but trying to match that up with other records and other collections. For example, at the National Archives, we hold Metropolitan Police records, but we don't hold other local police records. So we have quite a London-centric bias. So if you're looking at something in our collections and we've got something on London, I'd always recommend, if you're looking at policing or criminalisation of LGBTQ lives, to look at other archives as well, because otherwise you kind of get an unfair kind of bias towards London in the records. But I'd say the other key thing is really about language. So we tend to catalogue using the language of the time. And that's partly because we can't go back and ask how people would like to be described in the records. We'd be making assumptions, we'd be imposing our current language on people. But also the language it changes fast in some of these areas. We don't have resource to constantly catalogue things. As I'm sure you've experienced, things aren't always catalogued that in depth in the first place. So to recatalogue is just unrealistic. So we go with the language of the time. We put research guidance out. So we have a guide, for example, at the National Archives on sexuality and gender identity in our records. And we encourage people to use that to kind of think of the language from the time to then go back into the catalogue. But that's tricky, and it's kind of not an ideal solution in many ways, because there's then a barrier in terms of the language. It can be quite negative and not what we'd find acceptable now. And yet it's kind of, I guess, the best solution we've got. But I think that there's a lot of work going on to try and think of other ways of cataloguing to make it kind of less daunting and less off-putting to people. If you're new to a collection, it's not great to see all that negative language, but there has to be some way of kind of making that material accessible. I'm sure you come across that in your research, some of those barriers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think search terms have been a big one when you're sort of trying to find sort of key people, particularly with trans history. I found it's very difficult to sort of narrow it down. So you kind of but actually the National Archives guide did really help. Just in general, searching all kinds of archives with just terms to use has brought up a lot more results. So it's definitely worth checking out and kind of broadening your sort of idea of which terms you can search and what it's going to bring up. But it does often involve a lot of trawling through some less relevant results, although they can be just as interesting.
So, yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. Yeah,
definitely. Oh, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Vicky. It's been so interesting. It sounds like there's a lot of really good work going on at the National Archives to highlight hidden lives, particularly LGBT plus lives. So thank you very much, and happy LGBT plus History Month.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great to chat. I guess just to say that we're hoping to do more all the time on LGBTQ history. So watch this space, hopefully more to come.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you.